All right. Welcome, everybody. This is our new unit going into linkage institutions. We actually split this unit into two. So, this unit, Unit 3, we will cover Chapter 13, which will go over political parties. We will also go over mass media. And then in Unit 4, it's more the political socialization with things like elections, getting into how people can engage in elections, and then also interest groups. So the first linkage institution that we're going to look at is political parties. So this video is 13.1, dealing with political parties, and we'll go through up until slide 25. So this just kind of, I know it's a silly picture, but just showing the Communist Party, right? These are individuals who are part of this supposed team, and so that's what we're going to kind of look at is what does an actual political party mean? What does it do? And we're going to look at it with three specific principles. So first, with a political party, you would define this as a team of people seeking to control the governing apparatus by gaining an office through the election. So people, the electorate, citizens vote in the election, and ultimately whoever wins the election becomes the leader in the government. And usually it's not just done by one person. And so when the president wins the White House, they're usually not the only person of that party that will win offices. And usually when elections happen, there tends to be this wave effect where the person who wins the White House tends to win most of Congress as well. People similarly vote for both of those offices. So think of it as a team. And the way we kind of break it up is parties are three parts. The first is in the electorate, the citizens. How do people engage within the party, and how do you become a part of this team? You may never run for public office, and so with your voting, in addition to voting, you can engage in activities with the party. The other thing we look at with parties is with the lens of an organization, so looking at parties as a business and how it runs, day-to-day operations, platforms, things like that. And then ultimately, when a government is controlled by a party, what does that mean? Do they institute a program? What promises might they need to build? And when we look at who votes, the group that votes, we call that a coalition. And so we'll look at the groups a little bit too. So my generation, and maybe you can relate, maybe not, but I look at like Fluffy, the three-headed dog. So think of the parties as a three-headed dog. And ultimately, we're trying to look at how it's broken down into those three different segments. So for example, just looking at the picture. So Ronald Reagan is synonymous with what we look at as the Republican Party. And he really felt like the party platform of the Democrats in the 1970s did not reflect his values. And as a governor of California, was pretty moderate, but was a Democrat. Was the leader, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, so leader of a union, and then became, now is like a symbol of the Republican Party. And then when you talk about, this is Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, and the Roosevelts ran the Democratic campaign in 1932 was to run on the idea of providing Black Americans jobs, really for the first time in many respects. And so that was a large platform. And so we're going to look at how these different activities relate to parties and the coalitions that they will build within the people. So what is a party? So within this team, we look at it as a linkage institution. So as I mentioned before, you're probably not going to run for public office. So how do you get engaged in your government? The good thing about parties is that they are divided, they are fragmented. So you can be a member or a part as the California Democratic Party, California Republican Party, the Ventura Republican Party, Ventura or LA County Democratic parties, Libertarian parties, Peace and Freedom, American Independent. And so these teams are ways for people to get involved because the team will develop what's called a platform, like a list, an agenda of things that they want to accomplish. And they want to model that after what the people's concerns are. And so the benefits of joining a party is potentially you could have a significant impact in shaping that agenda. The other thing that parties do is they run campaigns. And this is a key difference for when we talk about interest groups. And you could even write this down in your notes now. Parties run campaigns. Interest groups do not run campaigns. Interest groups will donate money, they'll contribute, but they do not run campaigns. Only parties run campaigns. The other thing that parties do, just giving a context of the meeting, is they will ultimately create positions on the different things that happen within our country. So, for example, social movement with Black Lives Matter, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party have specific stances on how they feel about this, and they will bring this to light. This is definitely in the forefront, covered by the media, and so the parties want to make sure that they have an idea of what they would do if in office, or when they're in office, what they're going to do about it, and how the citizens should care about it. Same thing with immigration. Trump's response to citizen concerns is to tell the citizens, this is something that you should care about, and we're going to do something about it. Trump ran on the campaign of doing something about immigration, and so looking at inspecting contracts to build the wall at the southern border would be an example of this. And so letting the voters know about immigration policy, this is important. There is social movement, perhaps reform is needed, and so the parties will tell their electorate, this is something that you should care about, this is something that is important. The other thing that parties do as far as a task, in addition to running campaigns, is once in office, they will coordinate policy with each other. So this picture, a little bit outdated, but President Obama working with Governor Brown, and then the mayor within Fresno, name escapes me, but just looking at these different policies and kind of coordinating together. And while the mayor of Fresno is a Republican, still American, looking at local policy, and you have the coordination here with maybe Democratic values, perhaps overpowering, unfortunately, maybe the local interests. You also have, at a different state, right, you have Governor Cuomo, and then Mayor de Blasio. And so both as Democrats, and so mayor, especially mayor as of New York City, plays a large role within the policy making. And so as parties, it seemed at a certain point, especially during the summer, that perhaps they were not on the same page with the coronavirus, but it is important that they would coordinate together as the same party, having similar interests. So here's a theory, just sort of a vocabulary concept when we look at parties in general. So this class, unlike a history class, is trying to look at it more like a social science. So when you talk about political science, one thing that can be studied is how people vote, why people vote, and sort of those reasons behind the voting. And so one of these related to parties, one of these theories that we see is this rational choice theory. So this looks at when people vote, one theory in which political scientists assert that people vote is based on their own personal needs. So for example, my mother-in-law is a small business owner. So she tends to vote Republican. And the reason that she votes Republican is because she is a small business owner. And Republicans tend to favor less red tape, meaning less specific regulations from the government. She continues to be up in arms with Mayor Garcetti, and a lot of the burden, the undue burden, in her opinion, that it puts on small businesses. And so she tends to vote Republican. And while she does have perhaps some things that she agrees with the Democratic Party, the rational choice theory would be true about my mother-in-law as far as the way she votes, small business owner, and those economic values really contribute to how she votes and why she votes Republican. So again, just kind of looking at how we can look at this from more of a scientific way, and while political science may be perhaps like a lower science, we're really just talking about something that can be studied, something that can be researched, and so this is one way as which how people vote. Usually people are pretty moderate within the United States, and that's what we see is like a general bell curve. This is, what you would expect, and but ultimately what we're kind of looking at here is how people label themselves and kind of how people perceive others, and really it's a lot of in the middle. So looking at the three-headed monster now, I just kind of went over the meaning of the party. And so now moving into this next section, I'm going to break it down 1, 2, and 3. So the first part is this party in the electorate with the people. So people, citizens, will identify with a specific party. And again, because parties are linkage institutions, this is how you get involved. And so your self-proclaimed party preference, that's all there is to it. You don't need to be a registered voter to claim party identification. If you want to be a Republican, you just say, I am a Republican, and bam, you are a Republican. That is your party identification. And so just whatever party it is, you can change at any time. I am a Republican. No, wait, I'm a Democrat. Okay, good. Ready to go. Party identification. Don't even need to be registered to vote. Although, registered to vote, I would say, is a more official way to identify with the party. I personally identify as nonpartisan. It does mean that I, cannot vote in the primaries. I'll get to that in a moment. Sometimes I will change my voter identification to a specific party for sake of the primaries, and then change it back to nonpartisan. But that's like my own thing. Whatever you like to be. Decline to state. That is an option. Nonpartisan is what I choose. One thing that we see with the electorate, most times the electorate, if they vote Democrat for one position, they're going to vote Democrat for another. So if you vote Democrat for president, you're likely going to vote Democrat for Senate. You're likely going to vote Democrat for House of Representatives, so on and so forth. But occasionally what we will have are people that that have a ticket splitting kind of effect. And so it's where people vote for one party for one office and then another party for another. And when this happens, usually people won't vote for a Democrat for one position or a Republican for another. They may vote for a Republican for a Senate and then a Libertarian for like a more local position. And so oftentimes when you talk about this ticket splitting, the most likely candidate to split the ticket would be the independent. So Democrat and an independent, or a Republican and an independent. So we got Rand Paul, independent in the Senate, very libertarian. And then when you talk about Bernie Sanders, is much more liberal than most Democrats. And while he did run as a Democrat for president, that was likely for greater viability for the candidacy. But understand that Bernie Sanders is an independent, much more left. And so oftentimes people will vote maybe for Bernie and then a Democrat for another office and then Rand Paul, and maybe a Republican for another office. Most party identification you can see just based on this graphic. The number of Republicans in 1952, or people who identify as Republican just say I'm a Republican, is about the same. In 2004, and even looking up now, there is even less party identification on both sides, but you can see the change in the Democrats. A lot of perhaps dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party has led Democrats to become more independent, while Republican identification has pretty much stayed the same. All right. So this is a graphic that you could see as a stimulus on a concept analysis question. It's always important to read it first, make sure that you're picking out the pieces of information and being specific about the correct information. So for example, it says percent. You wouldn't want to say the number of electoral votes. You would want to be specific about it being a percentage. Same thing here, percentage of seats held by Democrats. So let's start. You'd want to start by reading the title. Southern State Partisanship in the United States House and Presidential Elections. And so it's kind of two different things here. So the electoral votes, percentage of electoral votes for Democratic presidential candidates. So only in presidential years, whereas the House will be every 2 years. So let's actually start with this one first. So percent of Southern state seats in the United States House held by Democrats. So Southern Democrats. So we could say, looking at this data, the number of Southern Democrats in the House of Representatives have gone down. The number of seats in the South has not changed, or it's not indicative here. The number of seats is not the concern. It's the number of seats held by Southern Democrats. So what does this mean? This data tells us that there aren't really very many Southern Democrats that are winning House seats in the South. They're mostly being won by likely independents or Republicans. We can't differentiate here necessarily, but that's what the data shows in this line, or curve, excuse me. So that's our percentage here. Going down, started at around 90%, close to 95%, we could say, in 1950. But then by 2004 or so, less than 40% of the seats in the South are held by Democrats. Okay. The other line that we see is the percentage of Southern electoral votes for Democratic president. So we only see this every 4 years. And so what we're looking at is the different years that there is a presidential election. And so in 1960, you see a lot of Democrats in the South actually voted for Kennedy. And so that's what this is demonstrating here. It goes down after when we go to, this is closer to Johnson. This is after Kennedy. Correction. This would be Johnson, because Johnson's from the South. Now that's part of why Kennedy had him as a vice president, because he was from Texas. But you can see, okay, Southern candidate, Southern Democrat, the electoral votes go to the Southern Democrat. And then when it goes into 68 and you don't have a Southern candidate, it goes back up, or it goes down. And then when you go to Carter, you see a higher percentage here, goes back down. And then goes a little bit back up in the 90s for Clinton, too. So what can we tell from here? The percentage of Southern electoral votes. When there is a Southern Democratic candidate for president, Johnson, Carter's from Georgia, if I didn't mention that before, and then Clinton from Arkansas. The electoral votes usually vote for them. If it's not a Southern Democrat, they don't vote for them. Second part of the three-headed monster is parties are an essential component of democracy. You need parties to pass platforms because it helps you coordinate the policy making. And so you can't do anything if you're totally fragmented. And while parties themselves are fragmented, their policies oftentimes align and they will coordinate with each other. So when you talk about democracy and bringing in the ideal party, now parties always fall short of this, but we look at it, again, going back to political science, what we look at with parties is a responsible party model. How could an ideal party exist? It would have a distinct and comprehensive programs. They know exactly what they stand for. And so for this, while Joe Biden and President Trump are perhaps not super adept at communicating policy, their parties do have very specific policies that they do stand for and programs that they do carry out. And while it may not be coordinated ideally, it is, going in this direction. Candidates are committed to the program as well. This is also very general, but it's sort of the idea that the parties have a promise and they will lead on that promise. And then once that government is controlled by that candidate, that party, they will fulfill those promises. So again, never perfect, but that's the ideal. And then when you talk about the majority party, this is looking at the true party that wins the election based on the electoral system. That should be the party that leads, because that is the party that is in the majority. Now, this is not always necessarily the case. For example, if the president does win the electoral college but not the popular vote, which has happened several times in our history, I think 4 or 5 times. But really, when we look at a situation like that, they may not have what's called the mandate, but that may not necessarily matter. But the idea of the ideal party is that the majority party that wins the election, they should be in control. And the majority party, when they enact policy, they should accept responsibility if that policy goes poorly. And if that policy, say like a large funding program, something like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, are those programs able to sustain, and if they serve as an anchor on the economy, what can be done about it? And so those parties in the future will be held responsible to those different actions. Again, American parties, we fall short of these. We strive to carry out all of these. And if you want to look at the party as an organization, as a business, as the second part of this three-headed monster, look at it as this is the ideal in theory. But in practice, it doesn't really get enforced. And that is potentially a concern, or I guess a reason why we can't really make the ideal parties, is because there is no way to really enforce any sort of party discipline. just one more sort of component about party organizations is parties as a business, as a team, right? When the people running the actual team, not just the citizens being members of the team, the actual leadership here, they will give out different jobs. And oftentimes jobs are given with what's based on patronage. So you get it based on political reasons rather than specific merit, rather than deserving it. And so really within the parties is we look at loyalty, we look at people who have paid their dues or that they're related, blood related. There is even a specific federal law passed by Congress after JFK made his brother the Attorney General that you can't do that anymore. You can't put anyone in your cabinet that is a direct family tie, direct family. So this is something we do see. We even had a president assassinated over it. That was Garfield. But this is another component of how the party works. It is a lot of favors and things like that. Okay. Each state, and I'll explain the pictures too. Each state, as a party, they look at the different setting up of elections. So, for example, in all the 50 states, when you have primaries, and the primaries are where you look at the candidates in your party, all the Democrats running for Senate, for this Senate seat, and then all the Republicans running for this Senate seat, same seat, but it's within the party what candidate you think is best. And so each state gets to decide how they want to do it. They want a closed primary? Do they want an open primary? We could see a blanket primary. Very rare, but it is possible. And then you also see caucuses. We'll get to caucuses later. But before you have a general election, you need to have a primary. And so the Democratic Party in California has decided they want an open primary, whereas the Republican Party in California, they have decided that they want a closed primary. So what does this mean? Closed primary is that you need to be registered for that party. So in California, you need to be registered Republican if you want to vote in the Republican primary. So we had our primary in March, and then we have our general election in November. So March of 2020 is the primary. General election is November 2020. So if you are a registered Republican in March, you can vote for the Republican candidates. In this case, there wasn't other candidates necessarily. But unless you were a registered Republican, if you were a registered Democrat, you could not vote in the Republican primary. So that is just the rule that the state sets up. Why would you want a closed primary? Well, for the Republicans, the argument is that you really want to pick someone who's actually a Republican. And so if it's an open primary, you're going to have other people who are not Republicans voting for who they think should be the Republican candidate, the single Republican. And so that may not be the most viable candidate to win in the general election because you have people who are not Republicans voting. So that's what we kind of see there. Democrats in California, they have an open primary, which means if you are Democrat or independent, registered any kind of independent party or just registered independent, you can vote in that primary in California in March. So in March, registered Republicans could vote. Non-registered Republicans could not vote in the primary. Registered Democrats, you could vote in the Democratic primary, but and independents could too, but Republicans cannot vote in the open primary. So you have to think about it as walking into a classroom, and I'm going to give you a piece of paper, and you're going to say, Mr. Bowman, I want the Republican piece of paper. And I will say, okay, are you registered Republican? And you say, yes, I'm registered Republican. Great. Here's the Republican piece of paper. Another student comes in and they say, okay, Mr. Bowman, I want the Republican piece of paper. And I say, great, are you registered Republican? And they say, no, I'm an independent. I say, too bad. You cannot vote Republican. Sorry, can't give you the Republican paper because it's closed. For open primaries, student comes in, they say, hey, I'm a registered Democrat. Great, here's the Democratic ballot. Go ahead. Another student comes in, hey, I'm registered Peace and Freedom. Fantastic. Do you want the Democratic piece of paper? Great, here you go. Hey, Mr. Bowman, I'm registered Republican. Can I get the Democratic primary? No, sorry, cannot. Cannot do that. So that's kind of the difference there. Open primary allows other people to gather input. We do see blanket primaries where you can just have one ballot, one piece of paper, and everyone is on there, but that's pretty rare. As an organization, every 4 years they put on a convention. And the point of the convention is to choose who is going to be the presidential candidate of the Democrats. And so traditionally, when things were a little bit slower, you wouldn't know who the candidate was until the convention. And when you have the convention over the summer, all the delegates from all the states would come in, and each state would take turns, and they would say, all the Democrats from Delaware, we cast our vote for this candidate, and all the Democrats from Maine, we cast our vote for this candidate, and all the, from Nebraska, so on and so forth. And whoever has the majority of the delegates would win the candidacy. Now, we usually know now because of the speed of the media. So now the National Convention is more of a formality, and we saw the first virtual conventions, which were quite interesting. And so really this really does serve a purpose. Traditionally, we didn't know, so that would be the night we know, and it's a big deal. We do know more beforehand, but the convention is the big party, and there's always awesome hats. So here's a couple of more recent examples. I like the one with like the Hillary bobblehead on the top. Great hat, kind of looks like a donkey, and then you got like the Trump pins and the flowers. Very patriotic. Lots of fun. Big party. Knows virtual this time around, but usually big party. Lots of fun. Things like that. Tacky hats. Party is an organization day to day. You also have to have the day to day type of responsibilities here. And so in between elections, every 2 years, every 4 years, in between election cycle, you do have a national committee. And so this is kind of like the leadership within the actual party itself. And they're going to run the day-to-day operations, the budgeting, different campaigns and things like that. They're going to strategically have a plan, a game plan for different elections. And that's going to be led by the national chairperson, so Tom Perez, for the Democratic Party, and then Ronna Romney McDaniel. I know in our class we actually saw her speak in front. I think it was in one of the Carolinas. But they're the leadership within the party to lead the business as the second part of the two-headed monster. And then very quickly, just the third part here, party in the government, which is the promises, is that whatever party takes control, there are specific policy consequences. When there are Republicans in the White House and in Congress, specific policies will be made, specific policies will be passed. Same thing if Democrats are in the White House. If we have a split government, it could be a little bit different. But the understanding of the party and the government is the reason they got there is because of the coalition that voted for them. The Republican coalition is the specific individuals in America who will vote for Republican candidates. They get the Republicans in office because they believe that if a Republican wins the office, that they will put in policies that they agree with. That's true for any political party involved, not just the two-party system that we currently have with the Republicans and Democrats. And really, parties and politicians want to generally act on the campaign promises. They want to make sure that they fulfill the promises so they can be reelected, fulfill the policy requirements. I know with like President Trump with the wall and immigration policy, large part of his early part of his administration, that was large part because of the people that voted for him were in favor of changing immigration policy, reforming immigration policy, and the Republican Party had done their job with that. So here's a couple of coalitions, different groups, different religions, socioeconomic levels, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, whatever it may be, different policy interests. These are some examples of like different coalitions. And, different interests too could be geographic interest, like I said, socioeconomic, religious. And so all of these different things make up the different coalitions. And so really understanding, and if I could go back real quick, if we look at this as ultimately we want the three-headed monster and the idea of what this party means. And this will give you a good idea of the background of this. I know this is a lot of information. I hope you have been able to watch this video in a couple of different parts. But really, if you understand the meaning of a party, you can break down the party into the three-headed monster. You should be good to go.